Let's start from the beginning. When and how did you get involved in the civil rights movement?
Well, I was growing up on 44th in Oklahoma. That's where my parents lived from the time I was 3 years old. All-white community, pretty out of contact with what was going on, except for what I saw in the national news. And that was not pretty. It was dogs being sicked on young demonstrators in Birmingham. It was people being beat up on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I think the thing that moved me more than anything else was watching Fannie Lou Hamer testify at the 1964 Democratic Convention in Atlantic City, talking about having been pulled off of a bus and beaten because not only did she register to vote or try to register to vote, but she was beginning to work as an organizer, getting other people to do that. And to watch her impassioned face and not be moved, you'd have to have a heart of stone. I couldn't believe it. You know, this was not the America I knew. It was not the America I had read about in high school history. And so I became convinced that not only did the situation have to change, but that I wanted to be part of making that change. And then shortly after the Selma to Montgomery March, some students from Marquette who had been on the march came to El Verno College, where I was a student, and talked about their experience, and also talked about getting a group together to go work on a voter registration project in the South. So I had been looking for something to do, and it presented itself. I volunteered. I had been working a part-time job at a local store, Dutchland Dairy store, but my parents were fine with my taking the summer to go work on this voter registration project, and so I did. It was an amazing eye-opener. I couldn't believe the poverty that I saw. We worked in Bullock County, Alabama, 50 miles southeast of Montgomery. Actually, after the orientation in Atlanta, when we were on our way to our county, we stopped overnight in Montgomery, and the person who was driving us pulled up on a street, rolled down his window, stopped a girl on the street and said, "I have some freedom fighters, do you have a place for them to stay?" And she said, "Follow me." Walked down the street to her house, and there we spent the night. Two of the volunteers from Bullock County, two young teenagers, and I were in that car, and we spent the night in the bed of the parents of that house. Where they slept, I don't know. The mom in the family, the mother in the family, sent the daughter who had shown us to her house to the store, and she bought some sausage and bread and some Kool-Aid, and that was our dinner. And we drank out of glasses that were jelly jars. And we had those at home too, but we had the kind with the smooth edges that were meant to be used as glasses afterwards. And that's not what these were. And I thought, these people have nothing. There was not an indoor bathroom. This was in the state capital of Alabama. I could see the Capitol building from their house. And they did not have indoor plumbing. She put a chamber pot, she pointed out the chamber pot under the bed and said, "If you have to use this in the middle of the night." I didn't know what she was talking about. But the two girls that I was with told me. So I saw amazing generosity, amazing commitment to the cause, amazing poverty. It totally changed my life, totally changed my life. When I came back, I saw Milwaukee through new eyes. Some of the volunteers in our group were African American, lived in the neighborhood of St. Boniface, the other side of town from me. And this sounds absurd, but I never noticed that black people lived in their own neighborhoods. And then I had friends that I wanted to be with, and it was hard to get to them, and it was hard for them to get to me. So segregation and the structure of our society that keeps people apart became real to me in ways that I could not have anticipated. I think, I think I was this naive when I went down south. I thought after this summer project, all racial problems in this country will be solved. And what I found out was we had a long way to go. We still have a long way to go.
Well, when you got involved, tell me what you did. You worked with the voter registration drive, then were you involved in the marches?
Right. Well, for the summer project, it was an SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference program, and the directives from the NCLC staff was not to challenge segregation, not to engage in demonstrations, but just to encourage people to register to vote. So that's what we did every day. We had a map of the county. We had pinpoint where all the African Americans lived. We visited every house in the county, encouraging every house, African American household, encouraging people to register to vote. At that time in Bullock County, there were 2 registration days a month. And the first one was early in July, after we arrived in mid or late June. The first registration day was in early July. So we thought we had about 100 people who said they would go to register to vote. As it turned out, 40 people came. And there was no end of petty harassment. You're not standing in line right. You have to leave. You can't register today. It's time for lunch. We have to close up for lunch. The staff disappeared for 2 hours, came back, took 2 more people, then they ran out of registration forms. Just endless harassment, endless, just petty reasons why people couldn't register. The white volunteers who came were very discouraged, very disheartened, very appalled. Where were the other 60 people who said they would come? Why did we have to deal with all this nonsense? But the local leaders were elated. They had never had such a high turnout. The people in the county were pumped. They considered this a great step forward. Looked at it in an entirely different way, and that gave us the courage to go on, and then the perseverance to go on. It wasn't always scary. Sometimes it was boring, walking down country roads in the hot sun, asking people to register to vote. It was scary sometimes. There was a point at which we stopped at, must have been the cabin of a sharecropper, a woman sitting on her porch, and we went up and started to talk to her, and she was very evasive, just and people were usually friendlier than that. So we wondered what was going on. Well, before very long, a white man walks out from behind the cabin and starts hollering at us, "What are you doing on my property? Get off, I'll call the police," blah, blah, blah. And he was about this far away from me, and I started to say things like, "We have a right to be here. This woman has the right to have whomever she might want at her house." The more I talked, the angrier he got, so that the tendons on his neck were sticking out and his hands came forward. I really thought he was going to choke me. Fortunately, one of the other volunteers, who's the leader of our project, had come around behind me and was pulling on the back of my shirt, and I got the idea that I should step slowly back, and that's what I did until we got to the car. Then we got in and drove away. So, and every night we would be followed home by young teenagers. I don't know, I look back at it now, I think, well, maybe they were just bored, white teenagers chasing us down the highway. The directive from the SCLC National Office was you should never let anybody pass you on the highway at night. That was how Viola Liuzzo was killed after the Selma to Montgomery march. Somebody tried to pass her and then forced her off the road. By this time, we didn't have a car in the beginning of the summer, but by this time my dad had bought a '59 Chevy and had somebody drive it down south for us to use. So I would drive that car home as fast as it would go, which was about 80 miles an hour.
Okay. Let's talk about Milwaukee and your participation in things here.
Okay.
What were you involved in?
When we came back from the work in the South, one of the other volunteers was Nathaniel Harwell. He had been going to St. Boniface Church, and he was going to join the NAACP Youth Council. So I did as well. At that time, the Youth Council was involved somewhat in the school desegregation issue, and before very long, got involved in picketing at the Eagles Club, which had a whites-only clause. And so I got involved in those demonstrations. The issue shifted a little from protesting the clause in the Eagles Club Constitution to protesting judges belonging to the Eagles Club, saying they could be impartial on the bench, but belonging to a segregated club in their so-called private life. And so that series of demonstrations escalated. That summer of 1966, we marched into Wauwatosa, picketed at the home of Judge Robert Cannon, who said he would rather be an eagle than a judge.
Wow. Interesting time.
Yeah, and then the housing issue was really crucial at that time. So we got involved in that in a number of ways, one of which was a young Vietnam veteran came to the Youth Council that had earned this reputation of being the go-to organization, the people who would do something to focus attention on issues. He had come back from Vietnam. He and his wife and their infant daughter went to rent a flat on 29th and Burleigh. And they were told by the landlady that she couldn't rent to them. What would my neighbors think? So this was around Christmas time in 1966. We went and sang Christmas carols to the landlady. And there was very religious experience, really, because we were talking about Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. There was no room for them in the inn, and the application of the story to the current situation of this young couple unable to find a place to live. The housing crunch was severe in Milwaukee. The African American community had tripled in size between 1950 and 1960, and grown again by 1967. But the opportunities to rent beyond a certain restricted area didn't increase. And the open housing campaign was not so much so that people could live in Brookfield or Mequon, it was so people could live on 27th Street. And what made it worse was that housing in the African American community was being torn down for urban renewal projects. And the Youth Council had a headquarters in that urban renewal project area on 13th and Valete, 15th and Valete Street it was, 1316 North 15th Street. It's in Martin Luther King Park now. There's not a street there anymore. But so the people living in the neighborhood would hang out with us and talk about they had to move, their house was going to be torn down, they didn't have any place to go. And at the same time, Val Phillips was introducing a fair housing ordinance, so Father Groppi called her and asked her if she'd like some support as she pushed for her ordinance.
Were you prepared for the kind of resistance the effort got?
I was a little more prepared in 1967 than I was in 1965, but I grew up on the South Side. When we marched across the viaduct, we marched to an area where I hung out as a teenager. We used to go to Pepe's Pizza on 16th Street with my high school friends. So it was familiar territory to me, and the African American teenagers in the Youth Council were terrified. I thought they were wrong. I thought it won't be. It turned out they were right. It was another eye-opener for me that that the hatred that had been somehow under wraps was uncovered, and it amazed me that I hadn't seen how deep and how pervasive it was before that.
How did that affect you?
Well, it shook me. But by this time I was pretty committed to doing what I could to address issues of racial injustice. It reaffirmed that commitment that this had to change. It was so irrational. If you look at archival news footage of those days and you watch the counter demonstrators, the euphemistically called counter demonstrators, shouting at the marchers, and you look in their faces, I think what you see is how ugly hatred is, and that's not the way to live. It wasn't the way that I wanted to live. I wanted a better world for the students that I was about to teach, and for any children that I might someday have.
What do you want people to remember about the marches, the protests? What's important?
I think what's important is, especially for young people today, to know that our city has a history, a tradition of young people standing up for justice. I think while a certain segment of the population was prepared to get jobs that opened up and move on, a lot of things closed down at the same time. The places where the fathers of youth council members were working, places like A.O. Smith, closed, and there weren't those kinds of jobs. So a lot of people got stuck in poverty and feel hopeless. And I think what it can be seen in a lot of young people today is a knowledge that there is injustice, but frustration that there is no way to address it. And I think the memory of the fact of young people in this community standing up and making a difference can serve as a positive model for young people today. Their issues may be different, their tactics may be different, but they need to know, they need to see that young people can and do have a role to play in making this a better world for us all.
Okay. As Father Groppi's widow, a quick couple of questions. What is it that we don't usually hear about him that the public needs to know?
He was a good basketball player. He took pride in being able to beat the guys shooting baskets on the playground. He loved to see people eat. I think one of the accomplishments of the movement in those days was that it fed enormous numbers of people. Sometimes only bologna sandwiches, a lot of salami sandwiches. He would go down to his family grocery store and buy salami and sausage and rolls and things. One of the things that that I learned from him is that you always want more food than you think you'll need, because people won't eat if they think that there's not enough. They'll be waiting for somebody else to take the food rather than take it themselves. You want to have lots of food, whatever you do. He really loved to see people eat, and he loved it, as a sit down and let's have a sandwich together, just friendly sort of thing. He also loved it on that bigger level, that macrocosm level. I mean, that's what I think led to his involvement in the welfare rights demonstrations. Here were people who were going hungry and they needed to be fed. And it's not just individuals contributing food, it's setting up a social structure that doesn't let people starve.
Do you think race relations have improved since the 1960s?
Oh, I go back and forth on that. In some ways, yes. But I think we're in denial about a lot of things. Sometimes you hear people say, well, 50 years ago or so, at least people were honest about their racism. Now it's all covert. I'm not so sure people were honest about their racism 50 years ago. People tried to be covert then, and people try to be covert now. And there's a lot of talking in code. Concerns about safety. I hear people in suburban areas talk about, is it safe there? And I hear it as, is it African American? It becomes a code word. I don't feel like I will be safe there. The Tea Party cry of, we need to take our country back, well, where did that come from, and what did that mean coming after the election of Barack Obama? I think there is still, among significant numbers of people, an implicit, maybe unconscious, subconscious definition of this country as a white country, and quickness to perceive threat at the success of African Americans when they are successful. So I don't know. I would like to say, yes, things have improved. And there are certain external protections. The fact that there is a fair housing law and that there is a fair housing council that seeks to make sure that that law is enforced gives people some recourse. But there are things that they need recourse from. There are injustices being done that still have to be addressed.
Is there anything we haven't talked about that you wanted to talk about? Anything that you think is important and worth talking about that I haven't covered in the questions?
One of the things, I guess I would just like to say something, express admiration for the young people who I was involved with, the African American members of the Milwaukee NAACP Youth Council. I think they taught me a lot. Many of them were younger than I was. I think that really as a group of people, well, a number of them have died, and I always like to pay respect to those who have already gone forward. A lot of those who have died are African American, and I see very much the reality that you have a longer life expectancy if you're white than if you're black, just by virtue of the friends that I've had who have died. So I'd like to pay respect to those who have died. I also like to acknowledge those people who were involved, who made this terrific contribution to the city of Milwaukee, many of them whose names were never in newspaper, whose photographs might be reproduced, but they aren't identified in those photographs. I wouldn't be here talking to you if it hadn't been for them. So I owe them a great debt of gratitude, and I think the city does, and I think the city has never quite acknowledged that. I think Milwaukee has tried to hide from its racial past, and you can't. It's there, and you may as well acknowledge it and make a determination that you want to turn away from the hatred and the ugly toward justice and something beautiful.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
That's it.